I now have a green light, so let's get started. Welcome everyone, and thank you so much for attending or tuning into my session here at Microsoft Ignite 2019. Today we're going to look at how to build dynamic pipelines in Azure Data Factory. My name is Katrine Wilhelmsen, or Catherine Wilhelmsen. I'm from Norway, and I work as a senior business intelligence consultant in a Norwegian company called Inmeta. I'm also a cloud evangelist there, which basically just means that I get to go out and teach and share knowledge at events like Microsoft Ignite and other community events, which I love. And because I do all of these community things like speaking and blogging and trying to just connect with the community, I've also been awarded a Microsoft Data Platform MVP for the past 5 years. You can find me on Twitter at CatherineW, and I also blog at catherinew.net. Just please note that there's no E in the middle of my name. That's just the funny Scandinavian spelling. The poor Catherine W on Twitter is not a fan of getting all the sequel tweets. But enough about me. Today, this is all about you. So today, you are an Azure Data Factory developer, and this is you. And if you are not currently an Azure Data Factory developer, just pretend that you are for this session. So when we're working with Azure Data Factory, we work with our source data sets, our sync data sets, and all of our different pipelines. And if you're not using any dynamic solutions right now, you end up creating, all the different source data sets, and you may have some temporary storage, again, a whole bunch of data sets, your sync data sets, and then you have to create the actual pipelines themselves. And if you're only working with a few of these pipelines and a few of these data sets, then this is completely fine. But once you start adding up the number of these different factory resources that you're creating, it can get kind of tedious. It gets a little bit boring when you have to do the same things over and over and over again. And that's where you have to think that there's got to be a better way to do this, right? There's got to be somehow that we can do this without having to do the same thing 100 different times. And that's where dynamic solutions come in. So before we keep going, how many of you have worked with SQL Server Integration Services, SSIS, before? Most of you. So you do know the pain points of dynamic solutions in SSIS, working with metadata, and how that can be kind of tricky. With Azure Data Factory, they've solved a lot of that. So building dynamic solutions can be very similar to doing that in SQL Server Integration Services, but they've improved on a lot of these things. For example, metadata handling, which makes things easier for you. So for dynamic solutions, there are a couple of reasons that you might want to work on dynamic solutions. So first of all, you might want to reduce that development time. You might want to just speed up development and get that value delivered to your business users faster than having to build out all of these different factory resources. And if you're cloning or doing things like that, it just takes a lot of time. So that's one of our goals. We want to reduce the amount of time that we are using to create these solutions. Then we might want to just work on our patterns. When we're working with data integration solutions, we usually work in common patterns. If it's ETL, slowly changing dimension patterns, or fact loading patterns, or different types of copy patterns as well. And we want to think about these patterns and optimize those patterns instead of just working on the plumbing and implementing that over and over again. And because we are working on the patterns instead of the specific implementations for each pipeline, we also end up reducing the risk of manual errors. Because I don't know about you, but if I do the same thing 20 different times, on the 20th time, I'm almost guaranteed to make some kind of little error that makes that one specific pipeline kind of blow up. So these are kind of our goals. And there was a question here, how dynamic should the solution be? And I'm going to read this as well. So a solution for me should be dynamic enough that you save time on development, but not so dynamic that it becomes difficult to understand or difficult to maintain. And what I mean when I say that is basically that you want to try and not make a solution that tries to solve everything. So take this from me. I've been, that hamster in a wheel. You're just running and running and running and trying to build out this metadata-driven solution to solve your entire project, and you end up just spending more time building out that solution rather than delivering that business value. So try to find the balance here. You can make things dynamic, but you might not want to try and make everything dynamic and reusable. Keep that in mind that your main focus should be to deliver that value and give that end result to someone else who can then go ahead and do something more with that data. So what can make a solution dynamic? There are a couple of different things that you can use inside of Azure Data Factory. So first is when you're working with parameters and variables. These are ways to pass input values into your pipelines or to modify those at runtime. You can also use expressions and functions to change the content of those values at runtime again. And then finally, you can use different loops and lookups to kind of externally configure and drive the pipeline executions. And we're going to look at some examples of this in this session today. So first up, for parameters and variables. Parameters, like I said, is a way to pass external values into your data pipelines. And once passed, those parameter values cannot be changed. So it's just a one way of passing some kind of value into your pipelines or into your data sets, linked services, or mapping data flows. And like I mentioned, they're passed in one direction. So if you want to create an entirely dynamic solution from like start to end, you need to create these parameters on all these different steps. So you might start with how to pass those parameters into your solution. And you can do that manually as a user by typing it in the interface as you click debug or as you trigger a pipeline. You can also have them automatically from a trigger, or if you are creating nested pipelines, you can have pipelines calling other pipelines, so you're passing them in that direction. And those parameters are passed into the pipeline first. That's the first point of entry for your parameters. Then the pipeline can, or the activities inside of that pipeline can look at those parameters and pass them on to the datasets or the linked services. So once you start building out the dynamic solutions, just keep in mind that if you want to parameterize it and make it dynamic from start to end, you need to go through all of these different steps. And the parameter syntax looks something like this. So you have pipeline.parameters.parameter_name, dataset.parameter_name, and linked service.parameter_name. Do any of you notice something kind of strange with this? It's a big room. I know you probably don't want to speak up. So this part here, this was something that I scratched my head on like the first time I saw this. Why do I have to say pipeline.parameters, but I can say just dataset? And at first, I thought that this might be as you know, some weird implementation here. But the reason is that for pipelines, you have parameters, but you also have something called system variables. And you can call these, and that's why you have to define that you're looking at the parameters before the parameter name. Otherwise, it thinks it is a system variable. So just keep that in mind that the syntax for getting that parameter name is slightly different for pipelines than for data sets and linked services. And that is just because in the pipeline scope, you have more things that you can actually work on and get some information out of it. So for system variables, Data Factory and trigger time are two examples here. It could also be the run idea, the trigger ID, and things like that. So lots of different system variables that you can work with. And that brings us over to variables in general. So what are variables? With parameters, you're taking an external value and you're passing that into your pipeline. Variables, on the other hand, live inside of your pipeline. So you can pass an external value in. Once that's passed, you can't change the value of that parameter, but you can assign that value into a variable and then change it throughout the execution of that pipeline. So if you want to do something for each iteration of a loop, or if you want to grab some kind of value from somewhere else and update that based on some condition, you might want to work with variables instead of just the parameters. There are two activities as well, like since variables live inside the pipeline scope, there are two activities that you can use inside of your pipeline to set and append those variables. So set is when you want to just set a value for a variable. Append is if you're working with an array or a collection, if you want to add something more onto that variable. So these are actual activities inside of your pipeline that you can use. Parameters, no activities for doing that, again, because it's static. So for variables, slightly different syntax again. So in this case, all you do is you reference @variables, and then you pass in the name of that variable. And there is a slight little catch with this, and that is if you're updating the variable name and you're referencing this somewhere else in your code, it's not going to be automatically updated. So there are a few pieces of improvement that I want to talk to Microsoft this week on how to actually make this completely dynamic, but for now, that's how it works. And if you're working with collections or arrays, types of variables, which you might want to do if you're running things in loops, you can do things like get the first value in that collection or the last value. And that brings us over to the next part of this, First and last are examples of functions that you can use inside of Azure Data Factory. There are a whole lot of different expressions and functions that you can use as well. For expressions, they just start with the @ sign. And this is where you want to change the value or the contents of that value during your execution. So for example, if you need to uppercase the contents of whatever parameter you're getting in, you can use the toUpper function. And you pass that in, and the entire expression starts with the @ sign. And that is just being evaluated into literal string functions during runtime. And there are a whole lot of functions, and we're not going to cover all of these today, but just a few examples of things you can do. When you're working with strings, things that you might find in any kind of program or system. Concat, substring, starts with and ends with. Same thing, you have all these different date functions that you can work with. You have collections for working with those arrays and collections of objects. You have logical things, so if you want to evaluate some conditions inside of your pipeline, you can do that as well. You can also convert values if you need to change something based on what you're getting in or want to output. And then you can also do things like different math functions in there as well. So most of the things that you would expect to find, you can also do inside of Azure Data Factory. One of the most common tasks that you might want to do in Azure Data Factory is to combine strings. And there are two ways that you can do that in Azure Data Factory. And I want to call this out because I knew about the first one at Concatenation. I've known that and I've used that for a while. And it was only this year I realized that there's also something called string interpolation. I'm not a programmer, I don't have that kind of background, so this was new to me, which is why I'm calling it out to you specifically as well, because you might see this in examples and in the code once you start working with this. So string concatenation is where you have an entire expression and you're passing in the little bits and pieces of the string values that you want to do. So you might have a literal string where you say truncate table, and then you're passing in the table name as a parameter. So you're concatenating that into one string, but you're just defining the pieces of that string that you want to tie together. The opposite of that is string interpolation, where you think of everything as one string, and you're just injecting those little expressions in there. So the syntax for this looks slightly different, where you don't have to say, put the literal string values in quotes and do the commas. Instead, you're just typing out the text, and then you're inserting the little expressions in there. In that case, the only difference is you'll see the curly brackets around the actual expression that you were using. So if you're working with something and you see those curly brackets somewhere, that is because it's using string interpolation by injecting some kind of dynamic value into a string. And this was new to me, but for me, I personally think that this is much more readable once you understand it, instead of doing concat and all the quotes and the commas and the quotes and the commas and having all of that syntax on there. So this is something that you might want to start using as well inside of Azure Data Factory. So let's go ahead and look at that. And I'll switch to my other computer. There we go. So in here right now, I have a fairly simple pipeline where all we're doing is copying some data. And in my example, I want to copy data from the Stack Exchange API into my Azure SQL database. So I want to get all the different questions that have been asked on Stack Exchange on a specific site with a specific tag. So right now, I've just set this up already with a copy data activity. I'm going to, let's see, scroll up a little bit here so we can see. So I've created an HTTP dataset that connects to that API and gets some JSON data in return. So if I click on preview data, just want to show you the output of that first. Let's expand this one, and we can zoom in. So what you can see here is we're getting a collection back of different questions. So we have things like the creation date, question ID, just a couple of different things that we want to load into our database here. So the output of this is pretty simple. I just want to load that into a database. But there are two things that I want to call out up here. So the first one is this site. So right now, I'm passing that in to that linked service, to my dataset, that I want to get everything from Stack Overflow with the tag SQL. So I want to get a specific set of questions in return. Right now, this is hard-coded. So all I get every time I run this is just all the SQL questions from Stack Overflow. But I want to make sure that I can change this and get different types of questions in return. So if I want to do that, there are a couple of different steps that I have to take for that. So inside of my source data set here, the first thing is I have to go to that data set and add some parameters in my connection. So what we can see here is right now, the relative URL down here, it is currently hard-coded. So what I can do here is I can use this add dynamic content to go ahead and create some parameters that I want to pass in instead of having that hard-coded string in there. So if I go ahead and do that instead, I'm just going to copy the contents of this first and then click on add dynamic content. And that opens up this pane on the right-hand side where you can see some of the things that I mentioned previously in the slide deck. So we can see all the different functions that we can work with. So I can expand these and we can scroll down and you can see the entire list of all the different functions that you might want to work with. For now, I'm just going to collapse this again because I don't want to do that. The thing that you will see right now is that I don't have anything else here. It's just giving me the options of adding functions as dynamic content, and that's because I haven't created any parameters yet. So there are two ways to create parameters. If I cancel out of this, I can click on the parameters tab here on the linked service itself. And I can, for example, go ahead and type in the site, which is one of the parameters that I want to pass in, Stack Overflow. So that is one way of creating a parameter for this data set. I can also go ahead, and if I click on this add dynamic content again, you'll see that I now have that parameter called site in there. I can also go ahead and click on this little button right here. There is a plus sign next to the filter pane, which might not be entirely intuitive if you haven't seen that before, but that actually is also a way of creating a parameter for that data set. So again, I can go in here and type in tag with the default value of SQL. So two different ways that you can create those parameters inside of the interface. So if I click on that, we'll now see that I have these two parameters down here that I can now go ahead and use in that connection string that we had. So if I go ahead and I paste the contents of that, you'll see that right now I'm passing in some different values here, some filters, some keys, just to make sure that I get the right data back. But what I'm interested in is to change this site tag here with the parameter. So what I can do is I can scroll down and click on that site. And if we scroll back up, you'll see that it has now added that for me. The problem, though, is that I'm trying to use this inside of that string right now. So right now, this is not going to work. I have to wrap this in one of those expressions that we had earlier. So I can do that by saying at and add the curly braces, and that's it. So now I'm taking that string and I'm just injecting that parameter into it. Same thing with SQL here. So I can also type this in, dataset.tag, and close out that brace. So now instead of having those hard-coded, I'm going to use whatever parameter value that I'm passing in. So if I click on finish, we can now see that this box here is also turned blue. So that shows me that I'm using some dynamic content in here. Now once I've done that, I've parameterized this data set. Back inside of my pipeline, we'll now see that I have these two new parameters, these dataset properties, pop up in that interface. So it's picking up that I've added those parameters to my dataset, and I can now go ahead and pass that in from my pipeline. So inside of here, I can go ahead and just type in Stack Overflow here and use those hard-coded values for each time I run this. But obviously, I would like to pass those parameters in from the pipeline as well. So same thing here. I can go ahead and click on parameters from the pipeline interface. And I'm just going to do that right now because that's a little bit quicker. And the tag, so let's do SQL. And then back inside of the source, I now just need to wrap that or kind of combine those together. So now I need to go and grab the pipeline parameter, make sure that I pass that into the data set. So I can click on Add Dynamic Content. And at the bottom here, we'll see these new parameters that I created on the pipeline. So I can now pass in site. And you'll see that in this case, we're using the pipeline parameters.site. So I want to pass that into the data set and do the same thing for the tag. And we can publish all of those changes. So now instead of having that hard-coded, for each time I run this pipeline, we'll just make sure that this is published first. I can click on debug, and that opens up this new interface where for each time I debug it, I can pass in different values. So in this case here, if I do the Stack Overflow and SQL first, it's going to just, oh, there we go, Unable to parse expression. Did any of you see what I messed up on that one? Let's see. Let's double check this one. I probably dataset.tag. No, I actually can't see that. Let's hop over to my other pipeline here. I'm just going to hop into this one instead. And let's see. Did it? Let's see. What did I mess up? Never do live typing in demos. Let's see. Oh, thank you. Yes, perfect. It started with the @ sign. All right, there we go. Thank you for calling that out. Let's try that one more time and see if that one works. That should be working slightly better. All right, thank you for calling that one out. So what happened there is when I clicked on the parameter and I inserted that in the middle of that string, it added the @ sign to the beginning of the string. But then I typed in the @ and the curly braces in there, and I completely missed that when I clicked on that one. All right, so now it's going in, and it's copying that data, and we can see here that it succeeded. I can click on the glasses here, and what we'll see is that I wrote 100 rows to my Azure SQL database. If I go in here to that database, we can now see that I now have a bunch of different questions in here that people have asked on Stack Overflow. If I run that one again, I will get a different set of questions in there just by changing that parameter in there. So I'm not going to let you watch all the different executions of this, but if I click on debug, I can go ahead and change this to something else. So once we have that, though, we don't really want to go in and manually click on, debug and run and debug and run and debug and run. We probably want to do some of that slightly automated. So I'll switch back to this one here. And we can continue on to the next step. And that is running this in a loop. So we probably don't want to run this manually for each value that we have. We can do things like running it in a loop instead with a specific set of values that we want to run it for each time. So in that case, we can use the ForEach loop activity. And that loops over a collection. And there can be two different types of collections in there. So the first one is a very simple array where you just have an array of values, or it can be a JSON object. That can be kind of complex where you have different types of key value pairs. It can be nested and so on. We're going to look at an example of how that works in the next demo. But when you're working with the ForEach loop, you need to remember that you're working on the current iteration by using the @item in your code. And this also was something that took me a little bit of time to understand because it's not really intuitive in the interface. But for each time you're running that loop, you can reference the current iteration by using @item. And an example for that for arrays, for example, you can have something very simple where you're passing in 3 different string values, and you want to pass that value into a copy data activity, for example. So for the first iteration, item is going to equal colors. And the same thing, if you pass all of that into the ForEach loop, so for each iteration, item is going to be colors, or item is going to be parts, or item is going to be sets. So very simple, if you have string values, item just equals whatever you have for that iteration. But if you're working with object items, the code behind it is slightly more advanced. So you can have something that looks like this, or maybe even more complex. In this case, you need to understand the collection that you're working with. You need to understand what you're passing in to make sure that you're working with the right properties of that object. So in this case, if you pass an item, you're actually getting all the key value pairs for that iteration. So you're going to get just both name, which is colors, and the extension, which is CSV. And that means that if you only want the name of that file, that's not going to work. In that case, you do need to know that the property that you want to get is a property called name. So in that case, you can use item.name or item.extension. So you need to understand the code behind the solution that you're working with to properly set this up when you're working with these loops. Again, same thing here when you're passing it in for each loop, for each iteration. Item.name gives you colors, item.name gives you parts, or item.name gives you sets. So this means that you have to go in and kind of look at the values, and we can look at that inside of the interface. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. So back inside of our Azure Data Factory, what we've done now is we only have this one copy data activity. But instead of doing it the way that I've done it now, I want to add this inside of a loop. So on the side here, under iteration and conditionals, I can drag a ForEach loop onto my interface. And then I can go ahead and parameterize that. It even tells you that this property should be parameterized, which, with the items that we want to iterate over. So in this case here, I can create a parameter with a simple array value, for example. So inside of the pipeline, this is a very simple step. So items, I can click the drop down and choose an array here and just create 2 values. So we can do SQL and let's do CSS. I like CSS as well. I'm also a hobby web developer. So I created a very simple array here as a parameter that I want to control that for each loop. Inside of the for each loop, I'm going to click on Add Dynamic Content, scroll down to that items parameter, and then click on Finish. And then this is where you need to go ahead and change that copy data activity. So we need to move that copy data activity into the for each loop. And what I can do here, if I click on Add Activity, I can go inside of that for each loop. But before I do that, I can right-click and just say Cut, and then click on Add Activity here, and paste that inside of the for each loop. I've just moved that copy data activity into the for each loop. And what I need to do now is I want to make sure that I wrap that up by getting that item, the collection that I'm iterating over, the current value, and pass that into the data set instead. So instead of using this tag parameter here, where it says pipeline.parameters.tag, I want to go ahead and change that to @item. So instead of using the pipeline parameter that we created earlier, I want to get the value from that parameter array and use that one in here as well. So I click on Finish. We can click on Debug again. I can also change or add these items inside of this array here, but we'll leave it like this for now. And then we can go ahead and look at this output. So what we can see here now is that the for each loop is running this activity twice, and it's running it for each loop. And we can then click on these actions here and see the input and output of those values in here. So for each iteration, it now succeeded. We can see that it wrote 100 rows for the first iteration and 100 rows for the second one. So one for SQL and one for CSS. So that's how you can just kind of add that loop to run it as many times as you need it to inside of that pipeline. But that brings us over to the next part that we probably don't want to go ahead and create an array and pass that in manually. That brings us over to kind of the final step of this, where you want to get those values that we now just kind of hard-coded as a parameter with those array values. We want to get that from some kind of external configuration instead. And that brings us over to lookups. So lookups is a way for you to get values from things like a configuration file, configuration table, and if you're working with database data sets, you can also use a specific query to get whatever you need or to get that data from a stored procedure. So this is very flexible that you can, what kind of data that you can get. And that means that you can grab that data that you're working with and use that to control the for each loop. And when you're working with the lookup, there are 2 types of outputs based on how you configure this lookup activity. There is a setting that you can choose to get just the first row. You would want to use that if you're getting just a set of values that you want to use, or you can use all rows, which gives you that collection that you can iterate over. And the syntax, again, for this is different based on whether you choose first row or the collection. And that means that, again, you need to understand this code to wire things up properly. So let's start by looking at the first row only. In this case, when you're saying activity lookup.output, which is all the output that you see on the on the left-hand side there, if you say dot first row, that's going to give you the entire object for that first row. Again, same as when the previous example that I showed. If you want to get a specific part of that, you need to go in and define that you want to get first row dot name or first row dot extension or something similar. With the all rows, it's slightly different. So in this case, we don't have a first row, but we now have the count, so we can get the count and the number of items that we're getting back if we want to use that for something, or we can get all the values. And in this case, it's the same thing that you're just passing in the values as an object to control that for each loop. For each iteration, you have to do item.name, item.extension, for example. So again, close that one out. First row only is if you want to get some configuration values that you have, for example, in a database, and just get some specific values that you want to use, or all rows where you get the entire collection. So let's create this final step here. Here we go. So final step for us is to go ahead and create that lookup. So under general, I can drag a lookup activity onto my pipeline. And then we can go ahead and wire that up. So I've already created a control table data set here that I can click on preview. And that is going to show me, in this case here, that I have this Stack Overflow site with the Stack Exchange tag. And what you'll see here is that right now I only see the first row on here, and that is because I kept it as first row only. But in my case, I want to go ahead and get all the rows and then just loop over that inside of my pipeline. So if I uncheck this and click on Preview Data again, you'll see that it gives me all the values in my configuration table. So if I have a solution where I want to get all the questions tagged SQL or CSS, or maybe I want to look at a different site, so the DBA site instead of Stack Overflow, but then look at SQL Server T-SQL, you get the point. I just define the different configuration values that I want to pass in. And then I can also do things like check if it is active, so I can control it just from my database from a different location, what I want to load for this execution. So there are two different ways that I can choose to get just the active values from this. One is I can go in and click on query down here and just type in a SQL query where I say where is active equals 1, for example. Or I can go ahead and create a, under iteration and conditionals, I can also drag a filter onto my interface and just kind of wire that up and then filter on the as active only. So two things that I want to say there is if you're working with a data set in a database, I would recommend that you use the query feature because that means that you have one less activity on the pipeline itself, one less activity that you have to pay for the execution of each time you're running that pipeline. So try and think about that to reduce the number of activities in your pipeline to keep the costs lower. It's not going to be a huge thing, but I always try to optimize my Azure Data Factory pipelines for cost, and that means reducing the number of activities if possible. So if you're working with a database, I would go ahead and write that query where is active equals 1. If you're getting the configurations from a file, for example, and you can't actually type in a query, then you would have to use this filter. But two different ways of doing that. For now, I'm just going to go ahead and wrap this up and look at the ForEach. So the first thing that I want to do here is, let's change this back to table. I'm going to debug and show you the output of this lookup first. So I can click on this little debug button and just run that first iteration. Or that first activity, sorry. If you are ever like, you can't figure out the JSON code, how to wrap this up, you can go ahead and click on these little action buttons down here in the debug interface. So on the output, this is similar to what I showed you in my slide deck, where we have the count, and then we have the different values in here as well. And in this case, where in my example I had name and extension, in this case you might want to get the Stack Exchange site, the Stack Exchange tag is active, last watermark date, and so on and so on. So once you set this up the first time, you might want to just do a debug and look at the output of this lookup so you know what you want to pass in to the ForEach loop. That's just an easy way of finding that. But for now, I just want to go ahead, let's remove that one. In the ForEach loop, instead of using the pipeline.parameters.items, I want to get that collection from my lookup instead. So I can delete that. And then if we scroll down here, I'll just reduce these. We can see here now that we have these activity outputs. So I can go ahead and click on lookup 1. I should give this a better name, but I'm not going to spend time on that now. One thing to note here now is that when I click on that one, it's giving me just the dot output. But I need to get dot output dot value because I don't need to get the count object in there. I just need to get the actual configuration values from my configuration. So I have to type in value. And again, this is something that I wish there was an easier interface for, so I didn't have to remember all of the syntax. But until they implement that, you have to go in and make this change on your own. So I'm going to click on Finish. And then the last part is to go ahead inside of the ForEach loop, inside of the source, instead of using that pipeline parameter, I now need to get @item.stackExchange tag. Or was it site that I had on here? I think this was site. Yes, no, site. Site, and same thing for tag. Exchange tag. So now I need to go in and grab that property that I want to use for this iteration. So if I click on Finish on this one, unless I did a silly typo again, let's see. So it is now running that lookup first, and then, oh, that failed. All right, I'm not going to debug why it failed. It may be something on my database side here, but the point is that you want to see is that we now have these 10 iterations here. So it is getting that output from the lookup activity and using that to control the actual pipeline itself. Let's just see very quickly what I did. Yeah, I probably had a typo in there. The point was to show you that you can use that configuration. So the thing that I want to show you here is that this was a very simple solution that we created to load some data and just pass in different parameters. I'm going to close out this data factory for now and show you a different solution where we have two parts of the solution. So this is slightly more complex. I couldn't go through and create all of this for you in 45 minutes. But just to walk you through this, this is a two-part way of creating a dynamic solution. So right now I'm looking at the pipeline that is loading data into my database. What I'm doing here, it's kind of the same concept. In this case, I'm looking at the total rows from the Stack Exchange website. So in here, it is going in and it's passing in slightly more parameters into my data set. So I wired this up to get more parameters in there. So I'm passing in that Stack Exchange site and the tag. I'm also passing in a watermark. So this is now taking it one step further and creating an incremental load in addition to just a parameterized copy for each iteration. And it's also just creating a specific filter here. This is a Stack Exchange API filter for getting a specific data set back. But if I preview this data, click on Finish. So what we'll see here all the way at the bottom is that in this case here, the page size is 100. So for querying this API from Stack Exchange, it's only going to give me 100 rows back for each time I call this query. But I know that the total number of questions since the last watermark that I passed in is actually 1,418 questions. And that means that I have to also create a dynamic solution for calculating how many times do I have to call that API to get all the questions back since the last time, and then actually go ahead and call that a number of times. So in my case here, I've added a variable as well. So in this case, I'm using the set variable activity, where I just have I go ahead and I use quite a lot of functions here. So range goes from 1, that's my first page, and then I go ahead and do some calculations based on the page size and the number of total rows to get that final number of pages that I have to go in and query that API. So in this case, it would have to be 15 times. So I have to query it 15 times to get all the 1,400 questions back. In that case, when I set that variable, the range function creates that array for me. And in my ForEach loop, under settings, I can go in and pass in that array variable. So this is just adding one more layer to that dynamic solution where I have to calculate how many times I have to run that ForEach loop. And then I go ahead inside of the ForEach loop and just run that copy activity as well, like we did previously. So that means that in this inner pipeline here, because I now have a ForEach loop in here that is running that API call, the number of times I need to run it, I also need to have another pipeline for getting the configuration values from my database, because you can't have nested ForEach loop inside of Azure Data Factory. So in addition to this inner pipeline, which is now slightly more advanced because we're calculating the number of pages, I also have this outer pipeline, just reduce this slightly, where we're doing the same thing that I showed you previously. So we're looking at that control table, we're filtering on the active rows, and then in the ForEach loop in here, we're just running that child pipeline. So now we're running a ForEach loop where we're for each time we're running that pipeline for the Stack Exchange site and the tag, and then inside of that inner pipeline, we're running another ForEach loop for the number of pages. So this is a very flexible and dynamic solution in here. And then finally, the last thing that we do here is we just want to go ahead and update that control table and set that latest watermark because we're now running an incremental load. So if we go ahead and we click on debug on this one, it's going to go in. We can look at some of the input and output. Hopefully this one won't fail. Oh, it did fail. All right. I'm not going to spend time on actually debugging this one in this case. Demo gods are not very happy with me on my birthday, apparently, or I did something else in here. But hopefully you can see the actual pipeline and the flow of that, how you can create parameters that you're passing in. You can use those variables to set the different values for each execution. And if you're using nested ForEach loops, you just have to separate things out into different pipelines. So I will go ahead and actually see if I can fix this pipeline after the session. If any of you want to look more into this solution itself, I'm happy to stick around for a little bit longer and show you that one. But let's wrap this up for now. So just to kind of summarize what we looked at today for dynamic solutions, the approach that I take and the approach that I like to do is start out by creating a hard-coded solution to test that pattern. Like we started with, just make sure that everything works, the API calls or the queries to your database works, and all of that is set up. And then you go ahead and you replace those hard-coded properties with parameters. It's just easier to make sure that your solution works up front than having demo failures when you're showing off to someone else. And then you want to probably execute that solution in some kind of loop, and that loop can be controlled from a configuration table, getting those values in there. And like I mentioned, parameters, variables, expressions, functions, loops, and lookups. There are a couple of things that I didn't show you in the session here today. The alternative to lookup, if you're working with files, is to get metadata. There's also an activity called get metadata that you can use to get, for example, the list of files inside of blob storage or data lake storage, for example, if you want to loop over that instead. And for the ForEach loop, there's also a different type of loop called until that you might want to use to query something until you get data back. So there are a couple more activities that you might want to look into if you're building out these dynamic solutions, but the approach to it, it's still the same. You want to look up data somewhere and then use that to control a loop or control an execution. So like I mentioned, with demo failures not exactly what I had planned here today. I'm happy to have a chat with that after the session if you want to talk about that. But otherwise, I do want to say good luck. The slides are available, so you can go in and reference that if you want to look at some of the examples and syntax, because you really do need to try this on your own and get some hands-on experience before this kind of sticks with the different syntax, with the item, with the parameters, and so on. I can take any questions after as well, by the way. So for that, I just want to say thank you so much for attending my session today. I'm very happy to continue the conversations outside of the session room after the break. If not, I hope that you enjoy the rest of your Microsoft Ignite, and I will see you later. Thank you.